Hey friends, it's Jimmy here, kindly asking you to click the like and subscribe buttons, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment saying where you're listening from. As always, this really helps my channel out in the algorithm and ensures that the history content keeps on flowing. Now, as I like to say, let's get down to business. The year is 500 BC at Olympia in Greece. The air is thick with the smell of olive oil, sweat, and sacrificial smoke. Athletes from across the Hellenic world, men from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, are gathered for the most sacred and prestigious of all competitions, the Olympic Games. To compete here was to affirm one's place in a shared Greek identity. But a disruption is brewing. A man from the north, a king named Alexander I of Macedon, has declared his intention to race. Immediately, his rivals protest. The contest, they argue, is for Hellenes, for Greeks, not for foreigners, not for barbarians. This moment, recorded by the historian Herodotus, cuts to the very heart of one of ancient history's most contentious questions. The identity of the Macedonians wasn't a simple matter of fact. It was a subject of fierce debate, legal challenge, and political maneuvering. For his part, this much less famous Alexander didn't respond to the accusation by pointing to his kingdom's culture or language. Instead, he made a legal and genealogical claim. He argued that his royal house, the Argead dynasty, wasn't native to Macedonia, but descended directly from the Greek city of Argos. More importantly, he claimed that his family was descended from the greatest of all Greek heroes, Heracles. The matter was brought before the Hellenodikai, the official judges of the Games. After examining the evidence of his lineage, they delivered their verdict. Alexander's claim was valid. The royal family of Macedon was officially recognized as Greek, and the king was permitted to compete. This episode is a perfect microcosm of the Macedonian paradox. It reveals that Greekness in the ancient world wasn't a monolithic ethnic identity, but a negotiated status. For the Macedonian king, his Hellenic identity was simultaneously denied by his peers on cultural grounds and affirmed by a pan-Hellenic authority on genealogical grounds. His people's place in the Greek world wasn't self-evident. It had to be proven, and even then, the acceptance was often grudging and incomplete. Over a century later, the Kingdom of Macedon rose from a peripheral power to a dominant force under King Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. The question of its identity became a matter of existential urgency for the city-states to the south. From their perspective, particularly that of the Athenians, the Macedonians were fundamentally different. They were stereotyped as a rough pastoral people, living a backward lifestyle more akin to the heroic age of Homer than the sophisticated urban culture of the polis, or city-state. Their original capital, Aigai, was even derisively known as Goat Town by the Athenians and other confirmed Greeks. This cultural condescension was deeply intertwined with political ideology. While southern Greece had evolved complex systems of democracy and oligarchy, Macedonia retained what many saw as an archaic and tyrannical form of government. They had a monarchy, where power was concentrated in a king and a martial nobility that derived power through force of arms. To the citizens of a fiercely democratic Athens, this was antithetical to the very concept of Hellenic freedom and civilization. No one weaponized this perception more effectively than the Athenian orator Demosthenes. In a series of powerful speeches known as the Philippics, delivered in the mid-4th century BC, he launched a blistering propaganda campaign against the Macedonian threat. Demosthenes' rhetoric was deeply personal and ethnic. He famously declared that Philip wasn't merely a non-Greek, but something far worse. He was a barbarian pretending to be Greek, a despotic wolf in sheep's clothing lying about his origin. It is essential, however, to recognize these speeches for what they were: masterful works of political rhetoric, not objective ethnography. Demosthenes' goal was to galvanize a fractured Athens into action against a leader who was outmaneuvering them at every turn. By deliberately conflating Macedonia's different political system with barbarian status, he could portray Philip as an illegitimate outsider, an existential threat to the entire Greek world. This view was not universally shared. Other prominent Greeks, like the orator Isocrates, saw Philip not as a barbarian destroyer, but as a potential unifier. To them, he was a fellow Greek with the strength to lead a pan-Hellenic assault against their common enemy, the Persian Empire. The intense Athenian hostility, therefore, reveals less about the objective reality of Macedonian ethnicity and more about an internal Greek hierarchy. In the eyes of many Southerners, to be truly and properly Greek, one had to adhere to the political and cultural model of the polis. By failing this ideological test, the Macedonians could be rhetorically cast out of the Hellenic family for political expediency. For centuries, the debate over Macedonian identity was fueled by these conflicting literary accounts. There was little hard evidence to settle the matter of what language the common people actually spoke. Some scholars argued that Macedonia was ruled by a Hellenized elite, but that the common Macedonians were something different entirely. The idea that Macedonian was an Illyrian language had strong currency in the world of academic historians. This changed dramatically in 1986, with a remarkable archaeological discovery in the ruins of Pella, the ancient Macedonian capital. Unearthed from a grave dating to the first half of the 4th century BC was a small rolled-up sheet of lead. When carefully unfurled, it was revealed to be a katadesmos, or curse tablet, a type of magic spell common throughout the Greek world. The text was a desperate plea from a woman, possibly named Phila, to the spirits of the underworld. She sought to bind her lover, Dionysophon, and prevent him from marrying another woman named Thetima, asking the spirits to ensure he would marry her instead. This was something drafted by an ordinary person, not a member of the high aristocracy, but the most revolutionary aspect of the tablet was its language. It wasn't written in the formal Attic Greek used by the royal court for official business. Instead, it was inscribed in a distinct local dialect that scholars identified unequivocally as a form of Northwest Greek, with strong affinities to the Doric family of dialects. The Pella Curse tablet is considered a game-changer, providing the first concrete evidence of the vernacular spoken in the Macedonian heartland. Its discovery has shifted the modern scholarly consensus decisively toward the view that ancient Macedonian wasn't a foreign language, but a northern dialect of Greek. It shows an ordinary Macedonian woman, far from the royal court, participating in a common Hellenic magical religious practice. She used her native Greek dialect to express universal human emotions of love, jealousy, and desperation. This suggests that Hellenic culture wasn't merely a thin veneer adopted by the elite for political prestige. Greek culture was woven into the fabric of daily life, belief, and language for the general population. When all the evidence is weighed, a complex picture emerges. In many fundamental ways, the Macedonians were deeply integrated into the Hellenic world. They worshipped the same Olympian gods as other Greeks, with Zeus, Apollo, and Heracles holding places of honor. Their kings acted as high priests and were patrons of major pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. From the 5th century BC onward, their elite class increasingly embraced Southern Greek art, literature, and customs, with Attic Greek becoming the language of the court. Their inclusion in pan-Hellenic festivals and the acceptance of their royal family into the Olympics were formal acknowledgments of their place within the Greek community. Yet, in other crucial aspects, they remained a world apart. Their society was not built around the independent city-state, but was a tribal kingdom ruled by a monarch and a powerful, land-owning nobility. This structure was more similar to that of their neighbors in Epirus and Illyria than to Athens or the other city-states. They also retained certain archaic customs, like specific burial practices, that had long been abandoned in the south. This duality was not entirely unique. Other peoples on the fringes of the Greek world also lived in tribal societies rather than city-states and spoke Northwest Greek dialects. They too were sometimes labeled as barbarians by southern writers like Thucydides, despite their undeniable Hellenic heritage and participation in Pan-Hellenic life. This places the Macedonian question in a broader context. The core of the ancient Greek-Macedonian divide wasn't primarily ethnic, linguistic, or religious, but political and ideological. The conflict was between two competing models of Hellenic civilization. For the Southerners, and especially the Athenians, the citizen-centric polis was the pinnacle of human achievement and the only legitimate expression of a civilized Greek life. Any Greek-speaking people who didn't organize themselves in this way were, by definition, backward, uncivilized, and barbaric. In the end, there was no single objective answer to the question of whether the Macedonians were Greek, because Greekness itself was a fluid and contested concept. To a political opponent like Demosthenes, they were dangerous barbarians. To the Olympic authorities, their kings were legitimate Greeks, even if there were questions about their common folk. To the Macedonians themselves, they were a distinct people who were also the rightful heirs to a heroic Hellenic lineage. In fact, to the Macedonians, they were more Greek than the city dwellers who had abandoned the ancient ways. The perception of their identity was entirely situational, depending on who was asking and for what purpose. This centuries-long debate wasn't resolved by philosophical argument or historical proof, but by the force of arms. Philip II, the so-called barbarian from the north, took a kingdom on the verge of collapse and transformed it into the most formidable military power in the region. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, his reformed army decisively crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, largely ending the era of the independent Greek city-state. Philip then established the League of Corinth, a federation that united the Greek states under his command, ostensibly for a great pan-Hellenic strike against the Persian Empire. His son, Alexander the Great, inherited this unified force and unleashed it upon the world. In one of the most breathtaking campaigns in history, he overthrew the Persian Empire and carried Greek language, art, and philosophy to every corner of the known world. This process, which we call Hellenization, was a deliberate policy of cultural fusion, creating a new, cosmopolitan civilization that blended Greek and Eastern elements. The ultimate irony is that the group whose Hellenic identity was most fiercely contested became the very instrument by which Greek culture achieved its greatest global influence. The modern academic consensus, informed by discoveries like the Pella tablet, now largely views the ancient Macedonians as a people on the northern fringe of the Greek-speaking world. They were Hellenic in their language and core culture, but possessed a distinct political and social identity that set them apart from the city-states of the south. In 1749, on the tiny windswept island of Corvo, the most remote outpost of the Azores archipelago, a furious Atlantic storm clawed at the coastline. For days, waves battered the shore, and when the tempest finally subsided, it had stripped away the earth from the foundations of a ruined stone building. There, a local reportedly found broken black pottery. Inside lay a trove of strange ancient coins, some gold, some bronze, bearing unfamiliar markings. This discovery ignited a mystery that has smoldered for over 250 years, posing a radical question. Could the masters of ancient Mediterranean trade, the Carthaginians, have colonized these isolated islands nearly 2 millennia before the Portuguese? This single dramatic find stands in stark opposition to the official, well-documented history of the Azores. The consensus, established for half a millennium, holds that Portuguese navigators in the 15th century discovered a pristine, wholly uninhabited archipelago. The Corvo coins, however, suggest a much older, more mysterious past. While the specific claim of Carthaginian colonization rests on unsubstantiated evidence, the controversy itself has inadvertently opened the door to new scientific inquiries. These modern investigations have successfully overturned the long-held consensus, revealing a far more complex history of human contact with the Azores than previously imagined. Inheriting a legacy of their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians built a commercial and naval empire that dominated the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Their power was projected by their primary naval vessel, the oared galley or quinquereme, a machine built for the specific conditions of their home sea. These ships were designed for speed and maneuverability, engineered for ramming tactics in the relatively contained waters between Sicily and Spain. They were lightweight, with shallow drafts, and packed with hundreds of rowers and marines ready for combat. However, these very design features made them profoundly ill-suited for the open Atlantic. Quinqueremes were notoriously unseaworthy in heavy storms and had almost no space for the food and water required for a long-distance voyage. Their operational model often required crews to sleep ashore nightly, a clear impossibility on a 1,500-kilometer journey across the open ocean. Their navigation techniques, while sophisticated for the era, were similarly constrained. Lacking magnetic compasses, Carthaginian sailors relied on celestial bodies, particularly the pole star, and detailed coastal charts. The surviving account of Hanno the Navigator's celebrated expedition down the African coast perfectly illustrates their methodology. He sailed along the coastline of West Africa, founding colonies in stages, never making a speculative leap into the unknown blue water. Even if a Carthaginian ship were blown off course and miraculously survived the journey to the Azores, an even greater challenge of the return would await. The North Atlantic is governed by a formidable system of winds and currents. A voyage west from the Iberian Peninsula means sailing directly into the prevailing westerlies and the powerful Gulf Stream. The return is harder still. The Canary Current and the northeast trade winds create a natural conveyor belt that pushes vessels southwest, away from Europe and deeper into the Atlantic. It wasn't until the 15th century that Portuguese mariners perfected the revolutionary technique known as the Volta do Mar, or turn of the sea. This counterintuitive maneuver required sailing far to the northwest, seemingly away from home, to catch the westerly winds that could finally blow a ship back to Portugal. Without this knowledge, any accidental discovery of the Azores would have almost certainly been a one-way trip. The case against a planned Carthaginian colonization isn't a single point of failure, but a systemic one. It combines a lack of motive with the wrong ships, inadequate navigational tools, and an insurmountable environmental barrier. The entire case for a Carthaginian presence in the Azores hinges on the Corvo find, yet the evidence itself is extraordinarily weak. The story comes to us not from a contemporary account, but from a report published in 1778 by a Swedish academic, Johann Franz Pudelin. He was recounting a conversation he'd had 17 years earlier, in 1761, with a Spanish numismatist who told him about the discovery from 1749. This third-hand narrative relayed decades after the event is a fragile thread from which to hang history. Furthermore, The crucial physical evidence, the pot and the coins themselves, vanished almost immediately. All that remains are Potelin's drawings of the coins, making modern scientific analysis, such as examining the metal for signs of long-term saltwater exposure, impossible. This lack of physical proof has led modern scholars to propose several powerful counter-theories. Some suggest the find was an outright hoax, or that the coins were planted by later visitors, such as Arabs, Normans, or even early Portuguese colonists. The latter theory suggests that the Portuguese, during their Golden Age, had attempted to present themselves as equals to the Carthaginians. Other scholars proposed a simple case of mistaken identity. The coins may have been found not on the Azorian island of Corvo, but in a town named Corvo in mainland Portugal. In this case, Potelin was simply confused, because the Carthaginian presence in the mainland Corvo would have been absolutely unremarkable. Proponents often link the coins to another local legend, an equestrian statue of a man pointing west, supposedly found on Corvo by the first Portuguese explorers. Like the coins, however, the statue was destroyed in the 16th century. No verifiable drawings survive, and its existence is just as poorly documented. For 5 centuries, the historical record was clear. The Portuguese, beginning with Diogo de Silves around 1427, discovered and settled an empty archipelago. This narrative remained largely unchallenged until 2021, when a groundbreaking study completely rewrote the timeline. Instead of digging for coins, an international team of scientists drilled into the mud at the bottom of Azorian lakes. By analyzing sediment cores, they looked for biomarkers that signal the presence of humans and their livestock. What they found was unambiguous. In layers of sediment dated to between 700 and 850 AD, they discovered high concentrations of 5-beta-stigmasterol. This is a compound found in the feces of large mammals like cows and sheep, alongside spores from a type of fungus that only grows on animal dung. This evidence proves that a pastoral community was living and farming in the Azores a staggering 700 years before the Portuguese arrived. By analyzing climate models from that period, the study's authors noted that anomalous wind patterns would have made sailing from northern Europe to the islands unusually favorable. This conclusion is bolstered by another intriguing line of evidence. The island's mice genetics links them not to the Iberian Peninsula, but to populations in northern Europe. The question is no longer a binary choice between the official Portuguese story and the fringe Carthaginian theory. The scientific proof of a Norse-era presence means the foundational premise of the traditional narrative, that the islands were never inhabited, is definitively wrong. While the Norse presence is now backed by hard science, another, even more ancient possibility remains locked in a heated and unresolved debate. Since around 2010, researchers on the island of Terceira have documented a number of strange structures and markings that they claim are the work of ancient peoples. These include man-made chambers cut into the rock into arrangements of massive stones that resemble European megalithic tombs. Some proponents have suggested these finds could date to the Bronze Age or even earlier, drawing parallels with ancient Mediterranean and Northern European cultures. This interpretation, however, faces strong scientific opposition. A commission established by the Portuguese government in 2013 concluded that the structures were either natural geological formations or recent constructions. They argue instead that these are natural grooves formed over millennia by the grinding action of large tree roots on the soft volcanic rock. This effect is exacerbated by constant wind and the region's frequent micro-earthquakes, at least according to this official explanation. In the final analysis, the romantic tale of Carthaginian explorers colonizing the Azores is an unsubstantiated legend. It's a story built on a flimsy foundation of second-hand accounts and lost evidence, and it crumbles under the weight of logistical, technological, and environmental improbabilities. The true historical breakthrough has come not from chasing ancient myths, but from the rigor of modern, multidisciplinary science. The definitive discovery of a Norse-era presence has shattered a 500-year-old consensus, proving that the Portuguese weren't the first to make a home on these remote Atlantic islands. The ghosts of the Atlantic may not be Carthaginian, but they are real, and we're only just beginning to learn their names and histories. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Also, don't forget that you can toss a clam in my bucket through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. They were the civilization that taught Rome the alphabet, the art of divination, and the spectacle of the gladiatorial arena. Their engineers drained the marshes to build Rome's first great sewer, and their architects designed the city's most sacred temple. These were the Etruscans, one of the most influential people in history, not in their own right, but because of who they in turn influenced. For over a century, according to tradition, the last three kings of Rome were Etruscans themselves. Yet for all their profound influence, the Etruscans are a paradox, a people whose own voice is almost silent. We can read their script, which they adapted from Greek traders, but their language remains a baffling mystery. It's a non-Indo-European island in a sea of Italic tongues. This linguistic puzzle has fueled a 2,500-year-old debate, one that began with the ancient Greeks and is only now finding a resolution through the lens of modern science. The central question has always been the same. Who were the Rasenna, as the Etruscans called themselves, and where did they come from? At their zenith around 600 BC, the Etruscans were the first superpower of the Western Mediterranean. Their heartland was Etruria, a resource-rich region in west-central Italy, what we now call Tuscany, defined by the Arno and Tiber rivers. This land of fertile soil and abundant mineral deposits, especially iron and copper, was the engine of their prosperity. From this base, their influence spread north into the Po Valley and south into Campania. The Etruscans were never a unified empire, but a loose confederation of 12 powerful and independent city-states. Governed first by kings and later by oligarchies of aristocratic families, these cities grew fantastically wealthy through extensive trade networks. They were connected with the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Egyptians through these Mediterranean trade routes. Their society was known for its luxury-loving elite, who filled their grand tombs with imported treasures and commissioned vibrant frescoes depicting lavish banquets. These elaborate tombs, laid out in grid patterns like cities of the dead, provide most of our knowledge about Etruscan life. They reveal a people skilled in metalworking, urban planning, and hydraulic engineering, who mastered the use of the arch and vault long before the Romans made them famous. The debate over Etruscan origins began in antiquity, framed by two competing narratives that have shaped the conversation ever since. The first and most famous comes from the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus. He recounted a dramatic tale of migration, claiming the Etruscans were originally Lydians from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. According to his story, a devastating multi-year famine gripped the kingdom of Lydia. To survive, the king divided his people by lot. One half remained, while the other, led by his son, Prince Tyrannus, built ships and set sail in search of a new home. After a long journey, they landed on the coast of Italy, settled the land, and became known as the Tyrrhenians after their prince. This narrative of an eastern exodus became the dominant explanation in the classical world, cementing the image of the Etruscans as foreign arrivals. Centuries later, a powerful counter-argument emerged. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian living in Rome during the 1st century BC, systematically dismantled Herodotus's theory. He applied a surprisingly modern comparative method, observing that the Etruscans of his day shared no discernible language, religion, or customs with the Lydians. Finding no evidence of a shared heritage, he concluded that the Etruscans were not immigrants at all, but an indigenous people who had always inhabited the Italian peninsula. Herodotus's story may have reflected the political realities of his time. It was perhaps a myth created to explain the lucrative trade relationships between the wealthy Lydian kingdom and the Etruscan city-states. In contrast, Dionysius's argument for a native origin fit neatly into the political project of Augustan Rome, which sought to construct a unified Italian history. For Emperor Augustus, this transformed the Etruscans from foreign predecessors into one of Italy's foundational peoples. For centuries, the debate remained a literary one. The shift came with modern archaeology, which provided the first physical evidence to test the ancient claims. The consensus among archaeologists today is decisive. Etruscan civilization wasn't imported wholesale from the East, but developed directly and continuously from the preceding Iron Age culture in the same region. This is known as the Villanovan culture, and it flourished between 900 to 700 BC. Major Etruscan cities like Tarquinia were continuously occupied from the Villanovan period onward, showing a clear line of cultural descent. The Villanovan culture, named for a site near Bologna, is now considered the earliest phase of Etruscan civilization. It was characterized by huts and a distinctive burial rite of cremation, with ashes placed in small, hut-shaped urns that mimicked the homes of the living. And I have to say that there's something quite endearing about this funerary ritual, imagining your ancestors in a comfy little home that you keep inside your home. But I digress. The archaeological record shows no evidence of a sudden invasion or population replacement that would signal a mass migration. Instead, it reveals a gradual evolution. Over time, the practice of burial began to appear alongside cremation, and simple villages coalesced into larger, more complex settlement. This transformation accelerated dramatically, beginning around 750 BC, when the Proto-Etruscans came into contact with the greater Mediterranean world. Spurred by intense contact with Greek and Phoenician traders, a flood of new ideas, technologies, and luxury goods poured into Etruria. The emerging Etruscan elite eagerly adopted Eastern artistic styles, feasting practices, and status symbols like gold jewelry and ivory carvings. This sudden influx of Eastern culture was once seen as proof of Herodotus's theory, but it's now understood as the result of dynamic trade and cultural exchange, not migration. The archaeological evidence reframes the entire question from where the Etruscans came from to how the Villanovans became Etruscans. The Etruscan language remains the greatest source of the civilization's mystique. It's a language isolate, a non-Indo-European tongue unrelated to the Italic languages like Latin spoken by its neighbors. While over 13,000 short inscriptions exist, they are mostly funerary, offering names and formulaic phrases but little in the way of literature. For decades, the most tantalizing clue was the Lemnos stele, a 6th century tombstone found on the Greek island of Lemnos. It was inscribed in a language with striking structural similarities to Etruscan, confirming a linguistic link to the Aegean. For many, this was the hard evidence that proved Herodotus right. However, modern scholarship views this link through a different lens. The inscription dates to a period of peak Etruscan maritime power, long after the supposed migration. It's more likely that the Lemnian text represents an outpost of Etruscans in a colony. In essence, it's a sign of their expansion eastward, not a relic of an Eastern origin. The language's uniqueness isn't a sign of foreignness, but of deep, local antiquity. It is almost certainly a relic language, a survivor from a pre-Indo-European linguistic map of Italy. It is the language of the Villanovans and their Bronze Age ancestors, preserved through the strength of their culture against the tide of Indo-European expansion. The final verdict in this ancient debate has come from the 21st century science of genetics. Early studies, which analyzed the DNA of modern Tuscans and even their cattle, found intriguing genetic links to the Near East, seemingly vindicating Herodotus. However, these studies couldn't distinguish between an ancient Etruscan migration and much later genetic mixing during the Roman Empire. The breakthrough came with the analysis of ancient DNA extracted directly from the bones of individuals buried in Etruscan tombs. A landmark 2021 study, analyzing the genomes of 82 individuals who lived in the region between 800 BC and 1000 AD, reached a clear conclusion. The Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from their Italic neighbors, such as the Latins of early Rome. They shared the same genetic profile, a mixture of ancestry from earlier Neolithic farmers and later Bronze Age pastoralists who arrived from the Eurasian steppe. There was no genetic evidence for a recent mass migration from Anatolia. The Etruscan gene pool remained stable for nearly 1,000 years, only changing dramatically during the Roman imperial period. This was when large-scale movements of people from across the Mediterranean transformed the genetic landscape of Italy. The genetic link between modern Tuscans and the Near East dates from this later era, not from the time of the Etruscans. This genetic revelation solves one mystery but creates a more profound one. The Etruscans carried the same steppe-related ancestry as their Indo-European-speaking neighbors, yet they spoke a completely unrelated, non-Indo-European language. This challenges the simple assumption that genes and languages always travel together. The most likely scenario is that the Bronze Age migrants who brought Indo-European languages to Italy didn't replace the existing population in Etruria. Instead, they integrated into the established Proto-Villanovan society, adopting the language of the local community. The weight of modern evidence from archaeology and genetics is now overwhelming. The Etruscans were an indigenous Italian people, their civilization a brilliant flowering that grew from the local Villanovan culture. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, it turns out, was right. The ancient story of a Lydian migration, while a compelling tale, isn't supported by the physical or biological record. The Eastern characteristics that so fascinated observers were the fruits of dynamic trade and cultural exchange, not the baggage of a displaced people. The unique Etruscan language isn't a foreign import, but a linguistic fossil, a survivor from the pre-Indo-European era of Italy. In short, after 2,500 years of debate, starting with Herodotus, the great Etruscan enigma is finally resolved.